Now, for our program, Carol Alexander Barnes will introduce today's speaker. Carol, again, is the granddaughter of Robbie and Joan Robertson, and she is married to our Rotarian, Keith Barnes. Currently, Carol works with Keith in their architectural company, KCB Buildings. Carol, come on up.
Thanks so much, Karen. I'm so happy to be here today and to present to you a very special guest, a vigilant activist in the movement for peace and the abolition for nuclear weapons, Dr. Ira Helfand, MD. I'd like to take a moment to share with you the incredible work that Ira has dedicated his life to. In 1985, an organization called Physicians for Social Responsibility shared in the Nobel Peace Prize. Ira helped to found PSR and is still an active member. Then, in 2017, another organization that Ira had a hand in the creation of won the Nobel Peace Prize, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And today, he brought the Nobel Peace Prize with him. He is an immediate past president of PSR's Global Federation, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which he represents at the annual World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. Ira is also a member of the ICAN's International Steering Committee and was the leading medical voice in ICAN's campaign for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. He has addressed national delegations at international conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Until recently retiring, he did all this while still practicing internal medicine and helping people one patient at a time. Today, Ira will be sharing on the profound ramifications of nuclear war and how great those impacts could be, even from a war with the limited use of nuclear weapons. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ira Helfand.
Thank you, Carol, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank the club for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm sure that you understand before I say a word that this is not going to be an easy conversation that we're about to have. And I appreciate your willingness to take part in it. A generation ago, we all understood the danger posed by nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, literally millions of people here in the United States, in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in Japan, Australia, took action because we were all so frightened about what nuclear weapons would do. And the action that we took, building a freeze campaign here in the United States, demonstrating across the world, played an incredibly important role in ending that danger. In the summer of 1983, the United States placed missiles in Germany, Pershing missiles, that were specifically designed to be able to hit Moscow in 6 minutes and enable the United States, in the belief of then President Ronald Reagan, to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. Less than a year and a half later, that same president sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev and said nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It was a 180-degree change in the policy of both the United States and the Soviet Union. And it took place partly because these two world leaders were able to understand finally the danger of what they were doing. But in large measure, it happened because of the efforts of millions of individual citizens around the world who stood up and said, this is an intolerable risk that you are running. You cannot hold our children hostage like this. You must stop the Cold War arms race. And it stopped. We almost got rid of all nuclear weapons at the Reykjavik summit in 1986. But when the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990, we all of us began to act as though the danger of nuclear war had gone away. It had lessened significantly, but it hadn't gone away. There were still tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in the world at that point. And the possibility of nuclear war continued to threaten all of us. We just didn't pay attention to it. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, that danger has escalated dramatically for a number of reasons. Foremost, been the deteriorating relations between the United States and Russia. something which clearly has come to a head with the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. But even before that, the situation between the United States and Russia had become extremely tense, to the point where former Defense Secretary William Perry has been warning us for the last 3 or 4 years, before Ukraine, that we are closer to nuclear war now than we were at the worst moment of the Cold War. In addition to the US-Russia situation, US-China relations are the worst they have been since the 1970s. And a potential flashpoint for military conflict and nuclear war exists in Taiwan. The situation in North Korea has gotten a fair amount of attention in the United States, particularly a few years ago when the US and North Korea were exchanging accusations and nuclear threats. That situation has not improved. The North Koreans have just conducted a series of missile tests, and it is believed they are about to conduct further nuclear weapons tests. It remains a very unstable and dangerous situation. And then there's South Asia, which we don't pay much attention to here in the United States at all, but it may be the most dangerous situation of all. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars since they became independent nations in the 1940s. They almost went to war twice in 2019. They both have significant nuclear arsenals. If they go to war again, it is almost certain this will turn into a nuclear war. And as I will describe in a few minutes, a nuclear war in South Asia will not just be an utter catastrophe for the people of the subcontinent. It will be a global catastrophe, including for us here in the United States. In addition to these 4 geopolitical flashpoints, which all increase the risk of nuclear war, there are 2 other factors that are very worrisome. One is the progression of cyber technology, and particularly the way that relates to the dangers of nuclear terrorism. We used to think that what we needed to worry about in terms of terrorists was that they might be able to get hold of maybe 1, maybe 2, probably relatively small nuclear weapons, Hiroshima-sized bombs, small by modern standards, and use those weapons to attack a city, New York, or Washington, or Moscow, or Tel Aviv, or Bombay, or London. And that's still a danger. It could happen. But we now understand that the real threat from terrorists is that they will carry out a cyber attack, that they'll hack into the command and control systems of 1 or more of the nuclear weapon states and either directly launch that country's nuclear weapons, or perhaps more likely create a false alert, convince the country that's being hacked that it is being attacked by a nuclear rival, and induce that country to launch its nuclear weapons in response to this false alert. This is a nightmare. People who do cyber security here in the United States are terrified about this prospect and really don't know what to do about it. Because when it comes to cyber terrorism, the aggressor always has the upper hand because the defense doesn't know what form the attack will take. And then there's one final factor that we need to be aware of, and that's the role of climate change. We don't often think of these 2 existential threats together in this way, but we should, because climate change is making nuclear war more likely. All of the nuclear-armed states have said publicly and repeatedly that eventually they plan to get rid of their nuclear weapons. Sometime in the future, when the world's safer, and they can do it. The problem is that climate change is making the world more dangerous. And as the climate crisis unfolds over the next coming decades, which it will, even if we do everything that we're supposed to try to minimize the effects, as the climate crisis unfolds, large portions of this planet are going to find it absolutely impossible to sustain their populations. And this is going to trigger migration on a scale we have never seen before. It's going to cause conflict within countries and between countries. And if nuclear weapons are still on the table, as these conflicts unfold, they are going to be used. So, what will happen if there is a nuclear war? Let me start by describing a large-scale nuclear war to you. This may seem like an unnecessary task. We all have in our mind that nuclear war would be terrible. We use the phrase that it would be the end of the world. I think we use that phrase sometimes to dismiss the threat, to gloss over it, to put it out of mind, rather than confronting what it would actually look like. So I'm going to do that to you for a few minutes. Forgive me, this is not pleasant. Let me start by describing what happens to a large city in a modern nuclear attack. All of us have images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in our mind. This is not what modern nuclear war would look like. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were important warnings of what nuclear weapons can do, but they do not begin to prepare us for the extent of the destruction that modern nuclear weapons would cause, a war between the United States and Russia would not involve a single or maybe 2 or 3 bombs the size of Hiroshima, which was 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. Rather, say a big target, Washington, New York, would be expected to receive anywhere from 15 to 20 warheads, each of which would be in the range of 100 to 800 kilotons, roughly 7 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. To describe what happens under those circumstances, I use the model of a single, very large nuclear explosion, a 20 megaton, 20 million ton nuclear bomb. The actual megatonnage that hits New York or Washington or Chicago or Los Angeles will probably be somewhat less. But the destruction caused will be even greater than I'm going to describe to you, because you cause more damage if you use many smaller weapons and spread them out over the area that you're trying to destroy. But the model of a single explosion is a little bit easier for us to apprehend. So let me use that. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this weapon, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within that entire area, the temperatures would approach those on the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. Something like this structure would just be flattened. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, gasoline, heating oil, natural gas, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would take place at every major city in the country, including cities the size of Milwaukee. We did a study in 2002 that showed if only 300 of the 1,500 warheads that Russia has pointed at the United States today, if only 300 of those warheads got through to targets in the United States, 75 to 100 million people would be dead in a half an hour. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure of the country would be destroyed. Everything that we depend on, there'd be no electric grid, there'd be no internet, there'd be no public health system, there'd be no food distribution system, there'd be no water coming out of our taps, there'd be no system for distributing fuel oil or natural gas to heat our homes. And in the months following that initial attack, the vast majority of people who did not die on the first day would also die from starvation, from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease, from exposure. And the same thing would happen in Russia. And if NATO were involved, the same thing would happen in Europe and Canada. But that's only part of the story. Those are the direct effects in the countries that fight the war. All of these firestorms would put enormous amounts of soot, about 150 million tons of soot, into the upper atmosphere. They'd block out the sunlight and drop temperatures across the entire planet, an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of Eurasia and North America, like here in Wisconsin, temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold since the worst moment of the last ice age. And under these conditions, all the ecosystems that have evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. A study that was published in August of this year in the scientific journal Nature, based on population figures from 2010, showed that this war would kill over 5 billion people across the planet, 3/4 of the human race. Given current population figures, the death toll would be something over 6 billion people. The same study showed, though, that it doesn't take a big war between the United States and Russia to cause a global catastrophe. If India and Pakistan go to war, and if together they use just 250 nuclear warheads, not 3,000, just 250, and if those weapons are the smaller end of the range, 100 kilotons, that war would kill over 100 million people in South Asia. But it would also put 37 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere, drop temperatures across the planet about 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is already getting into ice age conditions, and also trigger a global famine, not quite as extreme as we would see if the US and Russia go to war, but bad enough to kill more than 2 billion people across the planet, including 130 million people here in the United States. This would not be the extinction of our species. It would be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to believe that the very fragile, complex economic system that we all depend on to stay alive would survive disruption on this scale. Now, what I've just described to you is not the plot of a grade B movie. This is the danger which we allow to exist every day that we allow nuclear weapons to exist. And we have to understand that if we do not get rid of these nuclear weapons, this is what's going to happen. This is the future that will be if we do not take action. We are not here today because we have had wise leaders, or sound military doctrine, or infallible technology. At one time or another, we've lacked all of those elements, and we have come within minutes of nuclear war on at least 6 occasions that we know about. We are here today, as Robert McNamara, former Defense Secretary, said, because, and I'm quoting him, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war, end quote. And we have to understand that the current policy of all 9 nations that possess nuclear weapons is little more than a hope for continued good luck, which is a totally insane basis for formulating national security policy. Sooner or later, our luck is going to run out. And all of the terrible things I've just described to you are going to happen. But while this is the future that will be if we don't take action, it is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It's not as though an asteroid were coming at the planet and there was nothing we can do. These are little machines that we have built with our own hands. They're about the size of the chairs you're all sitting in. We've dismantled more than 60,000 of them since the 1960s. We know exactly how to do it. It's a simple process. What has been missing is the political resolve to dismantle the 13,000 warheads that remain and which threaten the existence of humanity as we know it. And it's up to us to do something about that, to create that political will. Now, this is where we get to something of the good news, because it is possible to do something about this. And I want to say something particularly with reference to Rotary at this point. Often when I talk to audiences, the overwhelming response that I can see in people is, oh my God, what am I supposed to do about this? You know, the whole world's going to blow up and I'm one little person. What am I supposed to do? This is not a response which we in Rotary can validly claim. We are not acting alone. We are part of an international family of 1.3 to 1.4 million people in almost every country on the planet. And if we act not as individuals, but as Rotarians, if Rotary as an organization acts on this issue, we can have a profound impact. Right now, before the Rotary Council on Resolutions, there is a resolution calling on Rotary to endorse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I don't know what the result of the vote has been. Last year, the similar resolution almost passed. It was defeated by a narrow margin. And I'm hoping that it will pass this year. And more importantly, if it does, I'm hoping that Rotary will take action. We are people of action. We will take action on this resolution. And we will commit Rotary's enormous educational resources to bringing the information I've just been sharing with you to the general public, because clearly people do not know this. And when they learn this, it changes the way they think and it changes the way they act. So this effort by Rotary can be part of a global effort around the world, starting about 8 or 10 years ago, countries that didn't have nuclear weapons, came together and said, this is crazy. We are not going to let our children live hostages to the decision-making of 9 individuals at the heads of 9 countries which choose to maintain nuclear arsenals. And over the course of several years, they negotiated a treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations. It was adopted in July of 2017 by a vote of 121 to 1. And it establishes an international norm that it is illegal not just to use nuclear weapons, but simply to possess them. That this poses too grave a threat and cannot be allowed. Unfortunately, the 9 countries which possess the nuclear weapons boycotted this process and worked very hard to undermine it. They are determined to keep their nuclear arsenals because they have bought into a false narrative, a myth, that somehow or other these weapons make them safer. That there's some magical quality that nuclear weapons have that guarantees they'll never be used. A myth which flies in the face of our history, where we know how close we have come to nuclear war on so many occasions. Our job now today, I think, especially those of us who live in the United States, is to bring about a fundamental change in our US nuclear policy that will lead the way for countries around the world to join us in joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We started a campaign called Back from the Brink in 2017 as a follow-on to the adoption of this treaty. The Back from the Brink campaign calls on the United States to lead an international effort with the 8 other countries which possess nuclear arms to negotiate a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate their arsenals. And it also calls on the United States to take 4 intermediate steps unilaterally that the US can do, which would lessen the danger of war while these negotiations proceed and would give momentum to the negotiation process. We call on the United States to announce the first use of nuclear weapons, to promise we will never start nuclear war. We call on the United States to end the situation whereby the President of the United States has sole authority to launch nuclear war. One individual can make this decision. It doesn't require Congress, it doesn't require the Cabinet, it doesn't require the Joint Chiefs of Staff. One person can make this decision. That should change. We call on the United States to take our nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. Hundreds of our weapons are sitting on top of missiles that can be launched in less than 15 minutes, and they are vulnerable to cyber attack. This is a vestige of Cold War thinking. It's totally unnecessary, even if we were to keep our nuclear arsenal, and it's wildly dangerous. We should end that situation. And finally, we call on the United States to abandon the plan to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years, enhancing every element of our nuclear arsenal and making it more deadly, more usable, more likely to be used. But most importantly, we call on the United States to take that first step, to invite the other nuclear-armed countries to join with us in negotiating the elimination of all of our arsenals. Now, we have no way of knowing if this will be successful. The United States could make this decision, could reach out to Russia and China and say, the world will be much safer, we will all be much safer if we get rid of these weapons, let's do it, and they may get a negative answer. But there's no reason to assume that a priori, because we've never tried that before, nor have any of the other nuclear-armed states. We have always acted as though we're just going to keep these weapons forever, and nothing bad is ever going to happen. So we need to try, because we do know, just told you, what's going to happen if we don't get rid of these weapons. And it is not a question of if, it is only a question of when. We hold in our hands the ability to determine what the future will be. It is a terrible responsibility. And by reminding you all today of what is at stake, I have placed on your shoulders a very heavy responsibility. Because if you know that the whole world is at stake, and you know you can do something to keep that from happening, then you have a responsibility to take action. But I hope you will view this responsibility also as something more positive. Each one of us wants to do something good with our life. We in Rotary believe we put service before self. We have been given the opportunity to literally save the world. And there is nothing better that any human being can ever do than to be part of a movement that saves the world. And I think Rotary can play an incredibly important role in this. I would hope that Rotary will take the stand, that it pass a resolution before the Council on Resolutions. I would ask this Rotary Club to specifically endorse the Back from the Brink campaign, as many Rotary clubs around the country have started to do. And I would ask each of you to consider, what other networks do you belong to besides Rotary? Do you belong to a faith community that has not yet endorsed this campaign? The Back from the Brink has been endorsed by over 400 organizations around the country. Faith communities, Rotary clubs, professional associations, social justice organizations, peace activist communities. What other communities do you belong to that you could get to take a stand on this? The Milwaukee County Commission has endorsed the Back from the Brink campaign. The city of Milwaukee has not yet, and we hope that that will happen as well. There's a resolution before the Congress, H-Res 1185, that endorses this approach to nuclear policy. I don't believe any of the members of the Wisconsin Congressional Delegation have endorsed, co-sponsored this resolution yet. We could ask all of them to do that. There are many specific concrete things that we can do. I want to address one final concern that has been raised sometimes in Rotary, which is that this is too political for Rotary to take on as Rotary. We're a service organization. We don't do political things. Two answers to that I think are important. One is, it's not true. Rotary does political things all the time. We are waging a worldwide campaign to eradicate polio. As we have seen over the last few years, vaccination is not an apolitical, non-controversial subject. But we made the decision that we needed to inoculate the world against polio. And we had to be very political. We had to talk to government leaders. We had to convince government leaders to put resources into this. And we just understood, if you have a humanitarian objective, that kind of politics, not partisan politics, but advocating for policy, is not only permissible, it's necessary. The second argument, I think, is perhaps even more important. What I described to you before is literally what's going to happen. This is not something I've made up to scare you today. And if this comes to pass, and any of your children or grandchildren happen to be among the survivors, I don't think they will accept from you an excuse that Rotary couldn't take action about this problem because it was too political. All they're going to care about is whether you did everything you possibly could to save the world. In the Hebrew Bible, there's a passage in Deuteronomy which is reported that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life that you and your children might live." That is literally the choice before all humanity today. And so let us commit ourselves to choosing wisely, and to acting, because we are people of action, with courage and determination, so that indeed our children might live. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions people might have or any discussion that people might want to offer. And I do want to say one other thing, actually, while people may be thinking of questions. This is pretty depressing stuff. It is appropriate to be sobered by this. Can't hear? Can you hear now? Sorry, step back too far. This is pretty depressing stuff. It is appropriate to be sobered by this. I have been working on this issue for over 40 years. I give talks like this several times a month. I write about this. I think about it all the time. I'm not an unhappy person. I'm actually enjoying my life, and I'm looking forward to the future with some optimism because I know that we can solve this problem. I know we can get rid of these weapons. And so don't allow despair to be an excuse for inaction. We have got to deal with this problem, and if we do, we're going to be successful. No one of us is going to get rid of nuclear weapons alone. No one of us can do the task entirely. But every one of us needs to do that part of the task which is ours to do. And if we do that, we are going to be successful. And we are all going to get to look in the mirror, 5 or 10 years from now and say, I helped save the world. And it's going to feel really good. Sorry.
Getting to something that's extremely topical in today's maybe I'm the only one that I don't understand in the Ukrainian situation. You know, what are those devices? What is a dirty bomb that has nuclear components? What kinds of weapons are they talking about when they're talking about going nuclear in that quote unquote targeted sense? I just don't know about that.
So there are three different kinds of threats in Ukraine at the moment. One is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which, were to experience a meltdown, would spew enormous amounts of radioactive contamination across Ukraine, Russia, and much of Europe, just like Chernobyl did. Secondly, there's a possibility of a dirty bomb. A dirty bomb is a conventional bomb that is stuffed full of radioactive material so that when it explodes, radioactive contamination is dispersed. And it's not really a weapon of mass destruction. It's been called a weapon of mass disruption. If you were to set one off in a city, a large chunk of that city would become uninhabitable for a very long period of time because of the very high level radioactive contamination. And it has been alleged by the Russians' side this week that the Ukrainians are planning to set off a dirty bomb and try to blame it on the Russians. The United States, Ukraine, Great Britain, other NATO countries have all said that this sounds to them like the Russians are planning to do this and are trying to establish as an excuse for escalating the war and are saying this as a way of deflecting blame when it happens. The third danger in Ukraine is the actual use of nuclear weapons. And people talk about tactical nuclear weapons. It's important to understand that a tactical nuclear weapon differs from a strategic nuclear weapon only in the sense of what it's designed to be used for. Tactical nuclear weapons are designed to be used on the battlefield against enemy tank formation, against a ship at sea. Strategic weapons are designed to be used against cities. The size, tactical weapons generally are smaller, but they're not small. I mean, some of them are quite small, but some of them are 10 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. So the fact that something is called a tactical nuclear weapon should not be mistaken to mean that it's a little bomb. This could be something much larger than anything that's ever been used in warfare before. And this is a real danger. Putin has threatened repeatedly to use nuclear weapons. And I think it's an incredibly tricky problem for the leadership here in the United States to figure out how to provide support to the people of Ukraine in their totally legitimate effort to defend their country from invasion while not inadvertently triggering World War III. And that's the dilemma that our leadership is trying to deal with at the moment. And so far, I think they've done a really remarkable job of threading that line. But it's, as is always the case in these kind of situations, we're walking in the dark. We don't know exactly what the Russians are thinking or what they're going to do. They don't know exactly what we're thinking, what we're going to do. It's a very, very dangerous situation. In April of this year, my organization, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, coordinated a statement with 17 other Nobel Peace Laureate organizations and individuals calling on Russia and NATO to both promise they wouldn't use nuclear weapons under any circumstances in Ukraine. They have not been willing to make such a pledge so far. And I think, frankly, that if we get through the current situation, we're going to have to understand that, once again, we've been very lucky. Because it's going to take a whole lot of luck to get us through this without bad things happening. And there's little we can do to affect the immediate situation. But what we can do is to resolve that if we are lucky enough to get past this, we will never allow ourselves to be in this situation again, because we will get rid of these weapons so that we don't have to worry about a nuclear war. Yeah.
Thank you for your interesting and sobering presentation. How do you bring Iran and North Korea to the table?
There are several countries that are going to be very difficult to bring into a nuclear abolition agreement because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that their existence is threatened by outside forces and that somehow or other nuclear weapons make them safe. Iran and North Korea, Pakistan is definitely in that category. Israel probably is, and Russia may be as well, for that matter. I think the way we do it is by helping the leaders of these countries understand two things. First, we need to address their legitimate security concerns. We need to offer to the horrible North Korean regime security guarantees that we're not going to do to them what we did to Iraq. And to Israel, we need to guarantee that they will not be destroyed as a country. And we're going to have to address these legitimate security concerns. But also, we need to help the leaders of these countries understand that these weapons are not devices which make them safe. These are suicide bombs. I had a fascinating conversation in the Israeli parliament about 9 years ago with one of the leaders of the Likud party, the right-wing party in Israel that is very strongly supportive of Israel maintaining a nuclear arsenal. And it was a public debate in the Israeli parliament. It was the first time there had ever been a discussion which explicitly talked about Israel's nuclear arsenal, which the Israeli government does not acknowledge. Everyone knows they have it. Everyone knows that everyone knows, but that they still won't say openly that they do. And this guy had come to the parliament basically to tell me what an idiot I was, how unrealistic, how naive, how could I possibly imagine, that there's good and evil in the world and we have to have nuclear weapons because we're the good guys and so on. And I gave a talk similar to the one I just shared with you and told him what's going to happen if Israel uses its nuclear weapons successfully against its enemies in such a way that not a single bomb falls on Israel. And told him what the environmental consequences of that would be, which is that the Israeli arsenal used against Arab states and Iran will destroy Israel for the climate disruption it causes. He was completely unaware of that. And at the end of the presentation, in front of a fairly large audience that was quite hostile to him, he came up to me and he said loudly so that everyone could hear him, I can't agree with you that we need to get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, but maybe we should get rid of most of them. And I just thought that was an incredible concession for him to make in that setting, an incredible change in his thinking for him to be willing to express publicly after a fairly short conversation. So it gave me a lot of hope that if we're able to sit down with these people in the leadership of these countries, we can convince them because it's true, and the truth has great power behind it. The final thing is, I think the keys to this are going to be the United States, Russia, and China. I mean, basically, these are the great powers in the world today, especially the United States and China, but also because of its nuclear arsenal, Russia. And if those three countries make a decision that their security requires a nuclear-free world, they will have the ability to bring the other countries along with them, even the North Koreans. If the Chinese, who have undermined our efforts to constrain the North Korean nuclear arsenal, if the Chinese were on side with that and the Russians were on side with that, the North Koreans would come along. I'm very confident with that.
I can understand why people would say that unless you get all nine sitting down at a time when all nine can be trusted, which is really hard to imagine. What I hear you saying, though, is that the next step is someone needs to try. Someone needs to make the overture, even if it's a waste of time. And I'm also hearing you say that neither the United States or any of the other nine have formally made that overture at some point. No one's suggested that we sit down and talk about this. And if no one has, what's the objection, say, in the United States from a president or a congressperson to making that overture?
I don't think there is an objection to the U.S. making that overture, and I think we should. We came close once in Reykjavik, the summit between Gorbachev and Reagan in Reykjavik. Gorbachev made a proposal that they negotiate a treaty to eliminate their nuclear arsenals completely. And Reagan accepted the proposal. This was the private meeting that they had with just their translators. And then they went back and talked to their advisors, and they both got talked out of it for all the wrong reasons. Reagan was convinced that the United States needed to maintain Star Wars, the missile defense shield, which we've been working on for 40 years and which still doesn't work. And Gorbachev said that was an absolute deal breaker. He couldn't get rid of his weapons if the U.S. maintained a nuclear deterrent shield, a missile deterrent shield. But aside from that, there really has never been any serious attempt to go all the way. Obama in 2009 in Prague gave a very important speech in which he said that the United States seeks the security of a world free of nuclear weapons. We were all very excited that he was going to push for this. The second half of that sentence was, but it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime. And that's been the attitude. They all say, someday we're going to do this. But someday is never. And that's what really has to change. It's interesting that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which are also the 5 major nuclear powers, the US, Russia, China, France, and Britain, all have a legally binding obligation to do just what we're asking them to do, to sit down and negotiate the elimination of the nuclear arsenals. They agreed to this in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6, and they have flouted that obligation consistently ever since and have no intention whatsoever at the moment of honoring that obligation, and that is fueling proliferation pressures across the globe because the rest of the world is saying, well, look, if you're not going to live up to your part of the bargain and negotiate the end of your weapons, why should we live up to our part of the bargain and not develop them? If they're so important to you, if they're so useful to you, why aren't they valuable and useful to us too? And it's a very hard argument to argue against because they're right. If there were some value in having nuclear weapons, then everybody should have. But there isn't. Let me just say one other thing before I take the next question, which is about this myth of why nuclear weapons are valuable. Because it is deeply seated, the idea that somehow or other they protect us. And in most of human history, if you had a bigger weapon than somebody who was your potential enemy, you actually were safer. And we feel this in our personal thing. If you're out walking your dog and you've got a big native that's got a Shih Tzu, you feel safer. But if the weapon that you're talking about is a nuclear bomb, you're not safer, because if you use your own bomb, you die. These are suicide weapons, and we have not been able to get that to understand that. We still go with this sort of gut feeling, big stick makes me safer, I'll carry a big stick. These sticks explode when you use them. They don't make you safer. And when we get that, then we're going to get the right kind of policy. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for your very compelling presentation. I consider it really a call to action, and I'm really hoping that our Rotary members and others can move on that. The question that I had two questions. You've sort of answered one of them, which is you mentioned 9 nations with nuclear weapons, and if there were any that we were aware of that have refused to acknowledge having nuclear weapons, and I know that Israel is one. I don't know if there's another one. The other question that I have is that, we talk about nuclear weapons, but there are a lot of conventional weapons that have been used that have had certain materials of nuclear nature that have been used, for example, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, that literally these bombs have incinerated people and evaporated people. So there's nothing left of them except shadows. And so what is really, as we see more and more wars with conventional weapons that have some of this technology, what is the concern there? Especially because some of these countries, you see years later, millions of children with childhood cancers and early deaths and a lot of these types of things. So.
Yeah, there was a poster back in the 60s that I just saw at somebody's office this week. War is not good for children and other living things. I mean, what we are doing with all kinds of warfare, it's just, it's all a crime against humanity. And at some point we have to stop doing this. I think that the great urgency is to get rid of the nuclear weapons because they will destroy the whole planet, our whole civilization, and we won't be able to do anything about any other problem afterwards. I'm also hopeful that the process of getting rid of nuclear weapons can serve as a model for dealing with a lot of the other great problems that we face as a society. The climate crisis, for example, which we clearly have got to deal with, is going to be much more difficult. It's going to require all of us to change the way we live. It's going to require a totally different economy than the one that we currently have. And that's going to be a really hard transition to bring about. Getting rid of nuclear weapons, if 9 leaders would sit down and negotiate the deal, I mean, it's done. It takes 4 or 5 years to dismantle 13,000 warheads. And this is something that is eminently doable. It doesn't change the way we live our lives day to day. It doesn't distort our economy. It restores many resources to the economy that are being wasted currently. And in the process of doing that, though, these countries are going to have to learn how to not trust each other. I don't think that's necessary, but how to be able to verify each other's behavior. That was Reagan's famous formulation: trust but verify. We didn't trust the Soviets. They didn't trust us. But we set up a system whereby we could verify that the other side was doing what it had to do. The process of establishing that regime that enables us to get rid of our nuclear arsenals, I think, can be a real model for how we deal with the climate crisis, how we settle other disputes that are now settled by warfare, and move us to a place where countries understand that given the natural problems we face, the climate crisis, pandemics, resource depletion, overpopulation, given those problems, the only way we're going to get out of this alive is if all the countries of the world start cooperating instead of competing with each other. And I think that the nuclear disarmament could be the catalyst, the way that we bring that about.
Yep, I know we're pushing time, so I'll be brief. Given the somewhat intractable nature to go from 0 to 100 and get all 9 countries to immediately declare they're going to remove their weapons, is there any validity to the strategy of reducing the arsenals to the point where the environmental destruction doesn't come with the number of warheads that remain?
Yeah, I mean, the first step that would happen in this kind of a process would be the United States and Russia would have to lower their arsenals dramatically. U.S. and Russia each have about 6,000 warheads. The next largest arsenal is the Chinese, which is about 300. And the Chinese have made it clear they're not going to start reducing their arsenal until we get down to their level. So an important part of this process would be for the United States and Russia to work out the details of market reductions in their current arsenals. But I think it's important that that be done in the context of everyone committing that we're going to zero. That we're going to make progress on the interim steps if we establish clearly that we are seeking the ultimate goal. If we say explicitly and mean it that nuclear weapons don't make us safe, we need to get rid of them. Lee Butler, who was the commander of the U.S. strategic forces in the early 1990s, helped design our nuclear policy in the 80s and oversaw it in the 90s. Became a passionate advocate of the abolition of these weapons. And what he said was, there's only one thing in the world that the U.S. military cannot protect us from, and that is nuclear weapons in the hands of a potential enemy. And so it has to be the highest U.S. national security priority to eliminate those weapons. And the only way we can do that is by declaring that we are willing to give up our own weapons as part of the process. And that's perfectly okay. Because if we all get rid of our weapons, none of us need them. I think if that kind of an insight, that kind of an understanding becomes the basis of our policy, then everything else is going to flow from that. You have time for one more?
So if we believe that citizens of the 9 nations that possess the weapons feel a sense of security because of the weapons, are there nations that are identified that don't have weapons that feel specifically threatened, that might have citizens that would rally behind a movement to eliminate the weapons elsewhere? We focus on the ones that have, but who are the nations or the citizens of those nations that don't have them that can make a change in the world?
Yeah, no, this has been the basis of the movement for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. 122 countries that don't have nuclear weapons, often spurred on by civil society in those countries, have played a huge role in bringing this whole issue to the forefront. They are in the lead on this question. And there's a very large movement in many countries that don't have nuclear weapons but are allied with the United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea, most of the countries in NATO. Strong movements advocating for the abolition of these weapons. The place where it's kind of lacking are in the 9 countries that have them. And here in the United States, there's this burgeoning movement. Back from the Brink has grown enormously over the last year. We have over 60 major cities around the country that have endorsed this campaign, over 300 local elected officials, 400 NGOs, several national faith communities, a number of major environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council. So we have a movement that's growing here, but it needs to grow quickly. Time is not on our side here. We really have to move this very quickly. One quick thing I just wanted to say before I let you get on with your business. This is the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize, which my organization won. I carry it around when I do public speaking. If any of you would like to come up and take selfies with it, I will leave it here. And please do that. Thanks so much.